Chris, thank you for making time. It's Friday after a very long week. You look great, like super fancy.
Very
Because I think you've been spending time talking about what happened on Tuesday, I imagine. As results were coming in Tuesday night, where were you looking most? At the top of the ticket or at Florida Amendment 3 or somewhere else?
You know, Jay, I take a holistic view of things. So that's why I threw my phone in the toilet. And so I was looking down. No, it was, all over, a lot of Florida, actually. Yeah. As you point out, that was obviously crucial for the presidency as well as the fate of cannabis. And I think I might have said this elsewhere. It's interesting to see that was sort of the one area where the broader Donald Trump project was rejected by voters.
Unbelievably. But also, it was where the Republican Party fractions were fighting, certainly led by the governor down there, who was doing anything, including spending taxpayer money, to defeat the measure.
Right.
And defeat the measure, I'll put in quotes. I mean, it got well over 50%.
It won, but it lost.
60%.
I mean, and just so folks know, it's the peculiar quirk, one of the many peculiar quirks of Florida. In order to pass a constitutional amendment, you need 60%, which is very, very difficult to achieve. Medical marijuana did achieve it in 2016. But we can get into this later. We also see, I think, voters are drawing a pretty sharp distinction now between medical marijuana and recreational. They like medical marijuana, which won in Nebraska by 70% to 29 against, with some others results still coming in, because obviously that doesn't add up to 100. But we don't even know if those votes are going to count yet, because there is a court case there. But in Florida, it was interesting as well to see that, it's the most expensive legalization campaign in history. I think we've established that. But I found this out just looking around. It's also, according to Ballotpedia, the most expensive initiative campaign of any kind in the U.S. in this electoral cycle. It's just $23 million alone were spent just on gathering signatures. And a lot of that is because in Florida, as another quirk, you have to pay the local county election commissioner, to validate each signature. And that can get expensive. In some counties, it's only like 10 cents per signature. But in other counties, it can be up to $1.90. And I think this says not only maybe have statewide legalization initiatives sort of reach their logical conclusion, it seems unlikely that another company is going to try to pass legalization in Florida, at least in the same way. And we can get into some of the details as well. But I think that it was maybe not entirely surprising. I think a lot of the polling, we can also get into how valid polling is. A lot of the polling was right around 60% for Amendment 3, which meant you're in the margin of error of the polls, which meant you really had to make up some ground there. But the eventual result, I think it was 55.5%. Again, huge. It would have been a huge win in almost any other state. California in 2016. That was roughly the same margin of victory. I mean, there's a lot of other states that legalized, like Ohio, for example. I think it was 53 to 47. So that would have been a win in most any other state, but that's Florida for you.
That's Florida. That could be a whole bumper sticker. That's Florida for you. But I want to zoom out, or at least look at a different race, because the implications of what will happen on the federal level, I think, are also still a big question mark. Obviously, we'll have a new administration. The Trump administration will have a new Senate. We'll think about a new House. But how are you thinking about even going between now and Inauguration Day, right? We have this ALJ hearing December 2nd. They're rescheduling momentum, I guess, if we want to keep calling it momentum. How are you viewing, and how are your colleagues viewing sort of what is about to happen on the federal level? Because that has major implications too. Rescheduling, safer banking, any other reforms. How are you thinking about that? Or is it too soon to tell?
Well, it is too soon to know exactly how things are going to shake out, but none of the early indications are very bullish. For example, you mentioned the new makeup in Congress. So there is going to be a new Senate majority leader. It's not going to be Mitch McConnell because he's retiring, but you think maybe that sounds good. But then you look at the three frontrunners, what I've been very creatively calling the three Johns. We don't know if this is the case yet, but John Cornyn, John Thune, and John Barrasso. John Thune is the minority for now, the minority whip in the Senate. all three of them have an F rating from NORML for their support for cannabis. I think it's Barrasso, who I may get this wrong, so don't quote me. I think it's Barrasso who even thinks possession should be illegal. They're from Texas, Wyoming, and South Dakota. South Dakota is a place that just rejected adult use legalization. These are not going to be people who are friendly to cannabis, and they're not going to be people who I think are going to spend a lot of political capital calling safer banking or anything more ambitious for a hearing. So, yeah, we don't know yet for certain, but early signs are pretty bearish. It seems like marijuana rescheduling is the only thing you can really bank on, and I don't know if that's safe either. The hearing on the 2nd is happening, but it seems like that's going to be more a scheduling and also an eligibility hearing. Oddly, you are in the letter from the DEA's leading administrative law judge sent to the people participating in the hearing. He basically said, you need to prove to me that you actually have standing. I'm not convinced. So, 25 people or 25 parties got a letter saying, yeah, you can come and participate in this hearing. But first, they have to prove that they actually have standing. And in order to do that, you have to demonstrate that you're adversely affected by the proposed rule, which is interesting because I think other people have pointed out that it already seems like the deck is kind of stacked against rescheduling just because of who has been invited to the hearing. There's about 10 or so folks that are either pro-cannabis, from cannabis companies, or otherwise involved with the industry. So there's about 10 pro to 15 very solidly against. I mean, there's familiar names in there like Smart Approaches to Marijuana. And there's also some folks that my favorite, I think, is called Cannabis Victims Educating Lawmakers. So you can probably guess how they feel about it. But all these parties now have to demonstrate that they can actually even be there.
Right.
Before we can have more hearings.
And be there is like also there, and when there is going to be a question mark that we'll find out more on December 2nd as well, maybe. Yeah. Which, if you know the calendar, that will be post the new administration getting to office. And this does not appear to be a priority for whatever administration's coming in, certainly the Trump administration. Like, they're not going to have a hearing on this in February in Congress. Like, this is going to be some time before we know more, before we know anything. Right. And December 2nd may tell us something about how the DEA may think about this moving forward, but the time horizon is still a massive question mark, which I think certainly we'll be discussing right after December 2nd at MJBiz in December as well. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, maybe even more than we thought there would be, and there's always uncertainty.
And I think we'll know a little bit more by December 2nd. We should probably have an idea, if not who Trump is going to select as his attorney general. At least maybe we'll have the first couple front runners. But it seems like the smart money is that if this cannabis is almost certainly not going to factor in Trump's choice for attorney general. It's going to be sort of like an ancillary effect. However that individual feels about cannabis will obviously be important, but that's not why they're going to be selected. You know, Trump has said that he'll respect that he supports the rescheduling process. That's what he said in his endorsement of Amendment 3 in Florida. You know,
which was done by a Truth Social post.
It was done indeed. Although podcast appearances. I mean, one of the things that Trump did to boost his turnout and his support among young men who, compared to some other demographics, don't vote as often. He did go on podcasts. He did very much meet them where they're at. And these are people, by and large, that support cannabis reform. And even there, he also signaled support too. But yeah, I mean, realistically, this is not probably in the top 100 things that like a Trump administration is going to look at very strongly, is going to deal with. I don't think cannabis is in the top 100.
Yeah, and it isn't often that the next 100, so 101 right. to 200, get a lot of conversation. Although we did have a conversation this week with the U.S. Cannabis Council, who is putting a lot of emphasis, or a lot of, not even hope, but emphasis on like the budget reconciliation process. And that just seems like the cannabis industry is going to learn a lot more about the inner workings of DC in 2025 than maybe it learned in the past 4, 8, or 12 years.
Yeah, and I think there's still hope that there can be some sort of deal made, maybe for safe banking, maybe for something else, and the lame duck. But again, I am not really sure how much energy someone like Chuck Schumer has for that. And I think one reason why, this is something that came up in conversation yesterday, the U.S. Cannabis Council brought it up, but some other folks do too. They say, look, like we have a divided front in Congress. I think that well, sort of two things that came up in my conversations this week. One is there's a big divide between the cannabis and the hemp industries. And we all knew this, of course, but it sounds like that divide is actually making things more difficult, more challenging in Washington. Because lawmakers don't have a lot of time to understand issues. And if someone representing cannabis comes into their office and says, actually, there's good THC and there's bad THC or something like this, a lawmaker is going to look at it with confusion and say, listen, I have other things to deal with. Like, let me take the other 15 calls I have lighting up my phone before I can even think about this one. And the other thing, too, is that we can't really – I was skeptical on this at first, but I think we can dismiss this at our peril. I had a lobbyist say yesterday that conservative lawmakers tell her, listen, I smell weed here in D.C. all the time. I don't like it. And I think – yeah, I used to be like, oh, whatever. It's just I smell it too. But no, I think that really does matter a lot for you, especially you have people who are a little bit older. They're from a red state and they're walking down the street to get into their car to go to Congress, or they're taking Metro or something, and they smell weed. They don't like that. And there's a lot of other people that like maybe on board. You might want their support. They also don't like that. So yeah, it could be the little things too that really slow things down for the cannabis movement in DC.
Yeah, in DC itself, and we check in with LJ Dawson, who writes for the Outlaw Report. DC itself, their regulations are a mess. Mess is probably too strong a word, but they have medical operators. They have these gifting shops. Like if the only places these Congress members go is their own district, where there's no legal weed, and DC, they're getting a skewed picture of what the DC what the legal market is like in most states, because DC itself is not a normal market like, say, Maryland is even sort of right down the street. So it is interesting to see sort of what is influencing what's happening on the Hill. But that's all to say, it's going to be different in January than it is in last January, right? I think
yes, absolutely,
and I think
absolutely,
that is what the industry, you and I, and people who are operating need to sort of think about, and what has played out. I don't know if you're seeing this too. When you do talk to operators who may have been hopeful that things would change on the regulatory front, they are now bearing down to become more profitable, become more efficient, get their operations in order, because there is no foreseeable timeline when relief is in sight from a regulatory or tax perspective. So they have to get their shit together now.
I mean, definitely, I think a lot of operators are still banking. I mean, we know that big multi-state operators are already banking on 280E reform. They've said publicly in their filings that they're already withholding that money from the IRS. And I think that is definitely like a high risk strategy. We'll see if it works. But yeah, I think, the smaller operators I talk to are definitely, I think, sort of by default having a more narrow view. They're very much like, all right, like how can we get, and this has also been consistent. I think you talk to an operator that's profitable, they're pretty small. Like I'm talking a couple dozen employees at the biggest. They have a very specific niche, and they're doing okay at it. And I'm not, obviously my specialty is politics, is not business. But yeah, I think that like expansion plans and things like this, I think are definitely on hold for a lot of, the big operators too. And yeah, like I think you're also there are going to be operators of all sizes that are going to see the risk that folks took to try and turn Florida legal, and they're going to see that it didn't work, and they're really going to reassess, I think, maybe some of their political involvement as well.
Yeah, I agree. Chris, I want to shift gears a little bit, because we're, what is it now, November 8th?
Yeah.
We are less than a month out from MJBizCon in Las Vegas. Obviously, you'll be there.
I will.
I'll be there. Like anything that you think will be driving the conversation those 3 or 4 days that people ought to brief themselves on before they get there so they can have intelligent conversations when they do. Is it about DC? Is it about state by state operations? Like, what are you hoping to draw from those couple days in Vegas?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think obviously we'll know a lot more about how rescheduling is going to happen because that initial hearing is December 2nd. And I think if you're looking at one policy choice that will affect the entire industry, it is rescheduling, which comes along with 280E reform. I mean, it affects every plant touching business, but obviously it affects everything else because, there is no industry without the plant.
Right.
So I think that's the major thing. I think obviously we'll know a lot more about what DC is going to look like. And yeah, I think like I think we are going to have, well, it's interesting. I think in terms of reform, I think more attention is going to be paid on Washington or to Washington, because I think we did see sort of at the state level, we've seen red voters now in the Dakotas reject legalization 3 times. We saw Florida pretty decisively say no, like at least, that's the formula that industry put forward, like that's not going to work. So I think we're going to see a lot of people sort of like looking simultaneously to DC for there to be any kind of like change in market. But I think we're going to see a lot of operators kind of like look inward. They're going to be aware that interstate commerce is not coming anytime soon. The only thing you're going to get from DC anytime soon might be tax relief. So you're going to have to deal with the market as it is. And I also think another thing dominating the conversation is going to be what to do with the intoxicating hemp-derived THC products question. It's going to color everything. I don't know how friendly a Trump administration is going to be to things like THCA flower. My suspicion is that as soon as people figure out what it is, they're not going to be very friendly.
Right.
And
check out Chris Roberts on Twitter if you want to know more.
Yeah, sure thing. All the time.
I love it. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. We'll be back Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific with Cultivated Live. It's always good to connect with you, Chris. We will see you in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks in Las Vegas. Thank you as well for your perspective, insight of post-election review and what the future might hold. And we'll connect with you soon.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me.
You got it.